Gallipoli by Kerry, Greenwood. Gallipoli. It was 1914 and crowds of young soldiers cheered and waved from the train to their friends and family. The air filled with steam as the train slowly started to move. "I'll write lots of letters," Bluey promised his mother. "Cheerio," called Dusty as he waved goodbye. They were Anzacs, members of the Australian Light Horse, on their way to the Great War. A convoy of troop ships carried the thousands of soldiers who had jumped up, eager for adventure. They were headed for the battlefields of Europe, where the world was at war. It seemed very grand and very important. The ships rolled across the ocean for days, then weeks. Bluey loved being at sea, but Dusty felt seasick. "What's the best cure for seasickness?" asked Bluey. "Land." Instead of being sent to France, where the British Empire was at war with Germany, the Anzacs sailed to Egypt. Bluey never dreamed he'd see the ancient pyramids. Their days were spent learning how to fight the enemy they were soon to face. It was hard work and the days were long. After months of training, the soldiers boarded another ship bound for Gallipoli, a small peninsula on the very edge of Europe. They were to fight a new enemy, Turkey, in their own homeland. "We're nearly there, Dusty," Bluey said with a hint of excitement. But as they got closer, they felt the shaking of the land and the sea and worried that they might not be brave enough for what lay ahead. The Anzacs arrived at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. As the sun rose, the soldiers leaped from their crowded landing boats and ran across the beach. Gunfire filled the air and there were explosions everywhere, on the beach and in the water. The cliff tops were full of Turkish soldiers. Some Anzacs made it to the hillsides, but many were killed on the beach or in the boats. Bluey and Dusty were among the lucky ones. Bluey and Dusty dug a burrow in the mountainside and tried to stay safe. So many of their mates had died too fast and too soon. "We've got to dig in, Dusty," said Bluey. "You watch my back and I'll watch yours." The diggers were terrified and tired. The bombardment was deafening, roaring around them like a volcano. The soldiers spent the next days building trenches and dugouts up the hillsides from the beach. They needed to keep themselves out of sight and protected from the constant gunfire. The diggers had food to eat and a little bit of water, but never enough. They had rations of bully beef and bread and hard army biscuits that tasted like cardboard, but no fruit or vegetables at all. "I wish I had a juicy tomato the colour of your hair, Bluey," Dusty joked. One morning, a stretcher-bearer named John Simpson tramped past, leading a wounded soldier on a donkey. Simpson and his donkey, Duffy, carried wounded diggers through Hellfire Gully to first aid areas on the beach they now call Anzac Cove. "I can tell you and Duffy are going to be mates, Dusty," Bluey joked. You've almost the same name and ears," he laughed, his eyes twinkling. "That donkey is a braver beast than I am," sighed Dusty. On most days, the thunderous booming of shells and the sing of gunfire was deafening, but sometimes there were small moments of silence and peace. It's too hot to sleep, Bluey complained. I'm going to write a letter home. My stomach's rumbling so loud. You'd think it's another bombardment, said Dusty. I'll go get us some food. Dusty made his way through the maze of trenches, his head down to keep clear of the Turkish snipers and their deadly hail of bullets. Suddenly he heard a sharp whining noise and felt a burning pain in his arm, and he fell backwards, hurt and afraid. "Bluey! Bluey!" he cried. Blinking up in the sunlight, Dusty saw the gentle face of Duffy. He heard a friendly voice. "Hop on, mate. Let's get you patched up." Simpson helped Dusty onto the donkey, and they all bravely headed onwards, despite the danger around them. In the dugout, the silence of the morning had been replaced by the din of battle. Dusty finally returned at sunset. His arm was bandaged and very sore, but he smiled. "Sorry, Bluey, I forgot the biscuits." Bluey was very relieved that his friend was safe, but the next day they heard that Simpson and Duffy had been killed, and Dusty and Bluey were more sad and scared than ever. The fighting was endless, and there were battles at places called the Neck, Gallipoli and Lone Pine. The Turks protected their homeland fiercely and bravely. Many men from both sides lay dead in no man's land. Everyone was hungry, tired and afraid, but they all did their duty as soldiers and as mates. The Anzacs had been at Gallipoli for months now. The weather was hot and they were sweaty and dirty. Insects bit them day and night. Sometimes they got letters and presents from home. Bluey opened a parcel wrapped in brown paper with string. "Fruitcake and tins of apricot jam." "It's hard to remember what it's like being at home," said Dusty. "It seems so distant and so different." Many of the diggers became ill from disease and from the dreadful conditions. Dusty caught trench fever from a lice bite. He was taken to hospital on Lemnos, an island not far away. Nurses helped courageously as the battles raged too close for comfort. The soldiers called them the Roses of No Man's Land. Dusty got better and returned to Gallipoli, eager to find Bluey. He found them at their dugout, preparing his kit. He was tired and frightened and about to head over the top for another attack. "I'm glad to see you, Dusty," Bluey said. "I've missed you. A man's no use without his mate." He took Dusty's hand sadly as he left to join the rest of their mates, all bravely prepared for the battle and possibly death. The battle was terrifying, full of the sounds of guns and injured men. Bluey ran and scrambled over the rough ground as best as he could. Suddenly a blinding light flashed in front of him and his ears rang with a piercing blast. He had been hit. In the quiet evening following the fight, stretcher bearers found Bluey lying in no man's land. Shell fragments from a bomb had hit his left leg. He was badly hurt but alive. He was taken with the other wounded soldiers to Lemnos. "Those roses will look after you, Bluey," Dusty comforted him. "Don't worry about me. Have a good rest at last." In between the fighting, an unexpected bond began amongst the exhausted enemies. They worked together to bury the dead and swapped gifts instead of gunfire. The diggers offered bully beef and the Turks gave fruit and sweets in return. Bluey would love these Turkish sweets, Dusty thought. He missed his mate and hoped his leg was on the mend. Weeks and months passed by. The weather got colder and the diggers huddled together to keep warm. They had only thin blankets to protect them from the rain and snow. Their trenches were muddy and they were miserable. Bluey didn't come back from Lemnos, but he sent Dusty a letter. "The food here is much better, Dusty, and you were right about the nurses. They tell me I might be heading home soon." After months of fighting with no success, the British and Anzac commanders agreed that the attack on Gallipoli had been a mistake. Too many men were dead, and nothing had been won. The Anzacs planned to leave without the Turkish army noticing. They invented rifles that used candles or dripping buckets to fire automatically, while the diggers headed back towards the beach and silently boarded ships in the starlight. 80,000 soldiers retreated from Gallipoli and sailed to the island of Lemnos in safety. Not one life was lost. Bluey lost his left leg from the shell fragments and was sent home to Australia. Dusty went to fight in the muddy trenches on the Western Front in France. Bluey sent him a letter every week. Dusty didn't come home until after the war ended in 1918. Bluey was waiting on the pier when Dusty's ship arrived. After the war, life went on. Bluey and Dusty were lifelong friends. They went to work, married, had children. Their children had children. I have curls of red hair like my great-grandfather Bluey. They were brave men. We remember them.